Hello, guys. Good to be back. I hope you all enjoyed the virtual networking. I did. I found myself with Dr. Andreas Beckerman. Quite an experience for me, a good 5 minutes. And I hope all of you were able to network and meet new people that you can also then be able to continue connecting with in the business. Like Afrolynk, we always say, innovate, connect, and accelerate. We're now moving onwards to the third panel. But before we go to the third panel, we are going to have two very interesting gentlemen, two of our founders from Africa, who are going to be telling us their stories. We also want feedback from you guys in terms of what is happening. Are you enjoying? Continue to put in right through. We can see there we have Chipo Gojo says thank you. We have also Ndeya says well done to Afrolynk. Thank you very much, Ndeya. We also have we say Tofara says thank you. Paul, let's connect after the conference. She sent also his LinkedIn profile. So guys, this is what Afrolynk is all about. Afrolynk Conference, Virtual Conference 2020 is all about connecting you to different people across the world. Take the opportunity, go to the networking booths, also go to people, search them, go to their LinkedIn profile, send your profiles, and continue to network. So as we wait to go towards to get one of our founders in, once again, welcome to Afrolynk 2020 Virtual Conference. We are streaming live from Berlin to all the parts of the world. Thank you for joining in and continue to innovate, connect, and accelerate. I hope you all enjoyed again. So now we are going to continue, and we have our first founder, who is a man that needs no introduction, a man who also comes near from home from me. So I'd like to introduce Mr. Vusi Thembekwayo, the CEO of My Growth Fund. Over to you, Mr. Thembekwayo, and welcome to Afrolynk Conference 2020.
Thank you, my brother. Thank you for those kind words. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you to everybody that's been a part of the conversation over the past few hours. Of course, it's an interesting time for us to be talking about connecting and linking Africans, founders, entrepreneurs, as well as accelerators and funders out there, because we're living in this time where we are, as my learned professor friend said it yesterday, physically distanced but should be socially connected. His view is that social distancing is the wrong way to think about it, and I concur with that. I wanted to share 4 thoughts. My conversation today really is going to center on this idea around what I think Africa needs today. For context, I run My Growth Fund Venture Partners. We have just been awarded the best impact investment firm for the year 2020 in the African continent. We're about a decade old, so we're about as old as the SDGs are themselves. And from the very early stages and the very onset of our business, we set out to be a Pan-African impact investment firm focusing on Series A and Series B businesses. And we've had an incredible run over the past decade. I did want to share what I think are 4 key things that I think are important in terms of this conversation about how do we take the continent forward? How do we scale? And how do we have a real meaningful impact and difference in the markets and economies that we're working in? The first is that I think it goes without saying that Africa's biggest challenge in my mind today isn't regulatory issues, it's not sovereign issues, it's not political stability. Africa's biggest challenge today, the way I see it, is the flight of talent. That it is easier, far easier for decent, competent, qualified, capable people who are African to find themselves in other parts of the world applying and plowing their skills for a decent return rather than doing it at home. And there is several reasons for that, not the least of which is the maturity of our markets, the depth of our capital market system, and most importantly, and a conversation we Africans don't like to have, but must be had, whether or not our economies are meritocracy-based or connection-based. My argument is that for many of our economies, they're connection-based. Your success really depends on whom it is that you know, rather than how capable and competent that you are. So we have massive challenges in the continent, right? Access to education, access to healthcare, infrastructure, financial services, and these are just to name but a few. And I think that what is incumbent upon us now and today, as entrepreneurs, founders, accelerators, and funders in the continent, is to solve really, really big problems. We can only solve big problems, though, if we do big things. And my argument is that the age and era of the small business really needs to be the bygone era when we think about building scale businesses in the continent. We need to start thinking about how do we build startups that become scale-ups, that become large market disrupting businesses, because the problems we're dealing with are so big, so deep, and so entrenched that what we're doing is we're creating a system of generational poverty where it's passed down from one generation to the next, generational illiteracy where it's passed down from one generation to the next, generational malnutrition where healthcare is passed down from one generation to the next. And that is the case because we haven't really thought about how do we scale up the impact of everything that we're doing. So we have to try and solve big problems. But to do that, we need to do two things. First, we need to understand that innovation has to be at the cornerstone of how we're building our enterprises. So we do need more IDEs rather than SMEs. We need more innovation-driven businesses that are led by innovation, introducing new market opportunities. Then we need small-scale businesses. And that's not to say that the SMEs are not important. Please don't misunderstand me. They often are the backbone of how our economies are built. They are the main provider of incomes and livelihoods for the rest of our brothers and sisters in the continent. But if we want to make a meaningful, real difference, then what we have to contend with is we absolutely, without question, have to start thinking about how do we innovate and innovate for scale. The second thing I want to share with you is that I think we're entering this era now where for founders, funders, and entrepreneurs, strategy actually has to center around empathy. And I'm not sure how many of us have that. I'm not sure how many of us have learned that actually the most important thing that you need to do business in the continent today is not necessarily a good product, not necessarily a good distribution, not necessarily good pricing, not necessarily a big balance sheet. What you actually need as the cornerstone of your strategy is empathy. The ability to look across the pond and recognize that the person you're dealing with is a human being just like you, that they have hopes, dreams, and fears just like you, that they have aspirations just like you, and that they want a better life for themselves in the future just like you. So everything we're doing, all of our businesses that we're getting into, I can tell you as a firm, whether we're looking at a transaction in healthcare, in ICT, in education, or in infrastructure, every single thing that we're doing thinks and moves from the point of empathy. Can we see the other people across the divide as human beings? Can we aim to make a real, meaningful difference? Because the problems we're facing are so deep, so entrenched, so systemic, and so insidious that if we don't move purposefully, deliberately, and do big things, then in the next generation, we'll be having the same issues. And then a final thought to share. And this is an important thought, I think, for those of us who are doing work in the continent right now as we speak. Those of us who are building enterprises, building businesses, dealing with the regulators and the legislators. I mean, just this morning I was saying to someone that I think what we need is an Africa-wide RSL. We still don't have an RSL in many of the countries in the continent. For those who don't know what an RSL is, it's the regulatory sandbox license. And you need an RSL because you want to regulate and standardize how business is done, how investors invest, how innovators innovate, and how entrepreneurs scale their businesses. If you don't standardize it, it makes it very difficult for global capital to come into the continent to embed itself. This year as a firm, we firmly went ahead with an Africa-wide strategy. So we've just announced our partnership in Tanzania. We'll be announcing our partnership with many of our other partners in Uganda, Namibia, and many in Egypt, and many other countries in the continent over the course of the coming weeks. Why? Because we recognize that we need to have a continent-wide approach to what is a continent-wide problem. But doing all of this is complex. It's tough, it's hard, it's not easy. Each of the different markets have their own little nuances. Nuance around culture, language, sensitivities around religion, gender, sexual orientation. So how do you balance then these idiosyncrasies in each of those markets with your desire to make a difference at scale? The lesson I've learned has been that what you've got to do is recognize the difference between power and control. Now, I imagine, like most of you in this conversation, I'm a A-type, high-driven Aries personality, right? So the thing must be done right, must be done perfectly. But once you do work in the rest of the continent and you work with partners, you recognize that actually you have no control over how things are going to pan out. But what you have is power over what you choose to do. I call it focusing on the left-hand side of the equation. So classical mathematics teaches you that inputs equal an output. And for many of us, we're often worried about the output. I imagine this conversation is going to center around the output. Who are the businesses? Who are we scaling? Who's raising funding? What stage of funding are we raising? How many people are we impacting? All of those are outcomes and outputs. And make no mistake, they're absolutely fundamental. But they will drive you crazy if you focus only on those. The thing actually to focus on is the inputs, the thing that you have power over. So what do you have as an input? Well, who do you choose as partners? Who do you work with? Whether or not you take a long-term view. Africa right now, I can tell you, there are a number of zombie funds all over the continent. What are zombie funds? For those of you who don't know, there are funds that are at the end of their life cycle, but have no dry powder. So they're not in a position to recap and recapitalize businesses that have been affected by COVID. And because it's the end of the life cycle of the fund, they kind of have to see out a fund that is now trading at a discount of what was even the initially committed principal capital funds by the LPs. And so for many of those GPs, they're sitting now at the back burner, just waiting for those funds to ride it out. Now, in that environment, it's easy to understand why you'd become complacent. It's easy to understand why you might become tired. But at the end of the day, you have to recognize that there is a big difference between power and control. And what I'm asking for and what I'm calling for all of us involved in this conversation is the recognition that we don't have control. We don't have control over the changes and regulations in each of our markets. We don't have control over whether or not the startup acts that have now been promulgated but have not yet been passed in 3 different countries in the continent. And some of them have been pending one country, and I will not mention which, for over 18 months. We don't have control over whether or not that's going to get passed tomorrow, today, or next week. But what we have is we have power. We have the power to choose with whom we work, where we work, why we work, and at the end of the day, how we want to matter and have an impact. And so what I'm calling for in this conversation is that each of us in this conversation brings with us a sense of understanding that the issues we're facing are big and they're vast, and that we're not going to solve those issues with small thinking. Secondly, that innovation has to be at the cornerstone of everything we're doing. Why? Because if you have only 2% of the population, as is the case in sub-Saharan Africa today, with access to banking and financial services, you can't afford to think of that the way you would do in a Europe, in a LATAM, or in North America. So innovation around how we build our businesses, absolutely critical and has to be at the cornerstone. Empathy has to be an important part of how we do business as business leaders. And finally, recognize that you don't have control, but you most certainly have the power. Thank you very much.